on our evening session here. Welcome. My name is Steve Maxwell. I'm with the Outerline Cycling, professional cycling blog in Boulder, Colorado. I'd like to welcome all you here to our stake. This is the session about the Caster Semenya case. One of the most interesting aspects of sporting competition and sports governance to me has always been the way in which sports can serve as sort of a forum or a laboratory for discussion and discovery around sort of cutting-edge social issues, or how sports can often act as sort of a leading indicator for issues that we need to get a better handle on and figure out how to deal with, not only in the sporting context, but also in society at large. Issues that perhaps society has not yet really figured out how to deal with. Historically, in the U.S. at least, we think about several types of issues or controversies that arose in competitive sports to begin with, to sort of incubate or drive a broader social issue. For example, we think about how the controversies that arose in competitive sports around race in this country led to in many ways helped to sort of lead to the striving for greater racial justice in this country, or how athletes today continue to draw publicity and put power behind various types of civil rights issues, or how the issues, for that matter, of athletes have sort of interplayed with, sometimes driving or sometimes reflecting the broader labor movement over the last several decades. One such timely topic, and the issue that we're going to be discussing here tonight, has to do with the issue of gender definition and gender rights. What is male? What is female? What really is the difference? How should this play into sports competitions? What relationship is there between how we deal with this topic in sports and how we should be dealing with it in broader society? Many of our legacy kind of social and behavioral patterns, as well as sporting competitions, have historically been organized around the assumption that gender was essentially a binary kind of issue. You were either male, you were a female, you fit into the social constructs created for those two categories, and that determined how you participated in sports. But as two of our speakers tonight have recently written, it turns out that gender and sexual identity are not quite as simple as what we learned in our junior high school textbooks. Clearly, over the last couple of decades, and particularly over the last few years, I would argue, we've gradually and sometimes painfully been learning that both from a socio-political perspective as well as from a scientific or biological perspective, that gender differences, in fact, are not really binary, that there's in reality a broad spectrum of gender categories in between those two ends of the spectrum, and that there is real biological variation between what we've kind of historically and simplistically considered male and female. And as often happens in these sorts of issues, some of the difficult or initially maybe even taboo sorts of challenges are first start to be discussed or first start to come to light in sort of a sporting context. And so the topic that we're going to be discussing tonight, I think, clearly falls into that category. Over the last several years, the IAAF, the International Sporting Federation over Track and Field, has issued a series of sort of, I would say, sometimes tortuous and changing regulations which have attempted to deal with this topic. Specifically, who can and who cannot compete in women's track and field events. Typically, these evolving rules and regulations have been driven or forced by individual women athletes who were successful in their sport, but who perhaps did not conform to the IAAF's idea of what a woman should be. And about a year and a half ago, the organization issued new regulations, which, to maybe oversimplify a bit, were basically geared to preventing some female athletes from competing in running middle distance track events. Specifically, those women who exhibited DSTs or differences in sexual development and or higher than naturally occurring testosterone levels. As we'll see tonight, most of those rules were essentially targeted at the premier South African runner, Caster Semenya. This ruling was just the latest in a confusing, think, highly emotional and often misguided attempt to more equitably regulate the sport, and at least purportedly to try to base those regulations on better scientific understanding. But as tonight's speakers, I think, will demonstrate, these efforts haven't always been that successful, and indeed they have often maybe injected more confusion than clarity into the whole discussion. The Caster Semenya story is one of today's clearest examples of the difficulties that both sporting and social institutions have in adjusting to political changes and evolving scientific knowledge. And as we'll see, the sports organizations don't always do a very good job at this. So we have with us tonight three distinguished experts on this particular topic, people who have studied and written and even provided expert witness testimony about the specifics of this case, what it tells us about the state of gender issues in sports, and what it implies about the roles and responsibilities of sports governance institutions and organizations. So our format here tonight will be, I will introduce each of our three speakers separately before they make their presentation. Each will speak for 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll have a few minutes left over for all of those of you who have survived the jet lag to have a little question and answer and discussion session. Opening up our session tonight will be Dr. Roger Pielke Jr. I've asked Roger to spend a minute or two just setting the context or a little bit of background here for those of you who are not familiar or not as familiar with this case. Roger's been on the faculty of the University of Colorado since 2001, where he teaches and writes on a diverse range of policy and governance issues related to science, innovation, and sports. Before joining the University of Colorado, he was a scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and he works extensively in the whole area of climate regulation as well. At the University of Colorado, Roger has founded and directed the Center for Science and Technology Policy Research and also the Sports Governance Center. His books include The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Science in Policy and Politics, The Climate Fix, What Scientists and Politicians Won't Tell You About Global Warming, and most relevantly to our discussion here tonight, his most recent book called The Edge, The War Against Cheating and Corruption in the Cutthroat World of Elite Sports. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Roger Pielke.
Thanks, Steve. So I had a nightmare once. I was given a highly technical PowerPoint presentation to a room full of jet-lagged Europeans after they had just been served 2 glasses of free wine. So here it is. So I'm going to go pretty quickly through this. The title of my presentation is should be, Fatal Flaws in the IAAF Semenya Regulations. The issues I'm going to talk about are somewhat technical, somewhat procedural, and the argument that I'd like to make to you is that the decision-making process that led to these regulations, where it stands now, was so deeply flawed in so many respects, we don't even get to the highly charged, controversial questions over who's a man, who's a woman, the things that everybody likes to talk about and to debate. They only gave me 15 minutes. If I had 2 hours and 75 PowerPoint slides, it wouldn't be 4, it would be like 27, but I'm going to give you 4 tonight. Is this for show?
On.
It's on.
Quer ver como?
Oh, the top ones don't work? What you do? Do that again. Oh, that's tricky. Okay. All right. I'm going to reclaim my 45 seconds. All right, a disclosure. I was a pro bono expert witness for Caster Semenya. I spent a week at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in Lausanne in February. I am a biased reporter here, just so you know where I'm coming from. So the fatal flaws. IAAF rewrote the regulations on the eve of the CAS hearing. They used flawed empirical science to establish the restricted categories. These are the races for which the regulations apply to. I'll say more about that. Also, in addition to flawed empirical science, there's flawed theoretical science to reclassify certain females as biological males. And finally, IAAF regulations require that medical professionals violate widely held guidelines for medical and research ethics. All right, so you may think that the regulations are about women with high testosterone. And that would have been correct from 2011 up until mid-February this year. On the eve of the Court of Arbitration for Sport hearing, the IAAF completely rewrote the regulations. And I teach policy and regulation, and in any setting in the real world, outside of sport, if you show up before a major court hearing and rewrite the regulations which have been out for public comment, in this case for almost a year, then the court would say, go away. Start over. That's not how we do it. Next. So instead, they rewrote the regulation, and one of the reasons the regulations were rewritten, I don't have time to get into all the details, is that along with Ross Tucker of South Africa, Erik Boye from Norway, we discovered some significant errors in their research. So the regulations are actually about a subset of females who the IAAF argues are really, quote unquote, biological males. So they're not regulating testosterone. They're regulating a certain class of individuals. Testosterone is how they fix these individuals and turn them back into allowable competitors. It's some ways a subtle shift, but it's really significant because it changed the entire course of the CAS hearing and how the regulations were presented and argued. So the IAAF, you can't read that, but that's from the Sunday Times. Martin Ziegler got a scoop that IAAF was going to argue that Caster Semenya was, quote, a biological male. The next day, the IAAF put out a press release and said, no, we're not doing any such thing. We would never classify an individual as a biological male. The very next day, I was in CAS listening to IAAF argue that Caster Semenya was a biological male. Throughout this process, one of the things I've learned, IAAF is full of wonderful people, but their adherence to honesty and truth has not been particularly exemplary. All right, so in the regulations, the IAAF says, in no way are they intended as any kind of judgment on or questioning of the sex or the gender identity of any athlete. In fact, there are provisions to punish individuals who do that. So here's Stefan Berman, the chief architect of the regulations. If a person claims to be a woman and wants to compete in this protected female category, then she should be happy to lower her testosterone level. If this is not the case, one must ask questions about her true sexual identity. Next. All right, so this is number 2. So when the regulations came out in 2018, they claimed they only apply to distances from 400 meters to 1 mile. We'll just call that the Caster Semenya distances. It was based on one scientific study. For those of you who follow, this was the study that followed the Dutee Chand CAS case that was provided to provide evidence for the regulations. Being a busybody, nosy academic, I and some colleagues asked for data. We hounded IAAF. We publicly shamed them. We went to the journal. We caused all sorts of trouble. Eventually, they relented and gave us 25% of their data, which we were able to use, next slide please, to show that the data was shot through with errors. And there's a table here. I'll post all my slides up later, and you can see actually that they're not just pretty pictures. But between 17 and 33% of the data points that they used for the restricted events were garbage, which in any scientific study, if up to 1/3 of your data is bad, you have a problem in your study. We called for the study to be retracted. We asked the journal that published it to give us the right to write a comment and submit it. None of that was allowed. We did get it in the New York Times and subsequently published it in a peer-reviewed journal. And IAAF, before CAS and since, has never contradicted our claims. And in fact, before CAS, they stopped relying on this study, which is one reason they couldn't make the argument they had before. Next. All right, so this is from a paper that Madeline and I have done. I'll post a link to it. This is from some research that was done by a group of scientists affiliated with USADA, U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. This is not a USADA report. So the theoretical idea behind the regulations from the beginning was that we can use testosterone levels in men and women to determine who's a man and who's a woman. It's really easy. Just take the testosterone level and put them in a category. So it's based on research. So and there's a number of studies that employ this methodology. So what they did is, I color-coded it in pink and blue to help everybody identify. They came up with what they call a normal male range. These are males who don't have certain genetic conditions. That's the blue range, and there's some numbers at the bottom, but you can see the male range is to the right of the female range, which is in pink. Next. So there's a class of individuals that, it's complicated, but it's 5-ARD2XY individuals, and if you don't know what that means, it doesn't matter. And what they did is say, well, let's take their testosterone and see where they match up. Next. And this is what they published. And hey, look, it's easy, because these individuals, that black bar overlaps with the blue bar, but it doesn't overlap with the pink bar, so these individuals must be, quote unquote, biological males. Simple. Science has spoken. It's the truth. So what we did is we replicated the study. And what we found is, you're jumping, get my punchline. It was erroneous. It was an error. It was a mistake. And so they published a big, long, massive correction that was as long as the original paper. And you can put my books back up there, everybody saw it. All right, next. So when they fix it, it looks like this. Oh, so what did they do in the paper? In their correction, they simply said, well, if you're 5-ARD2XY, by definition, you're a male. They gave away the pretense that they were trying to classify them. But here's the problem. These individuals, like everybody in this room, they're born and assigned a gender. Some of them are male, some of them are female. To employ this methodology, you have to fail to recognize that certain individuals already have a gender. And raise a question about it. Why would you do that? So here's what happens next. If we take the 46XY 5-ARD2 males, so in this class, about 70% of individuals are identified as males at birth and continue as males, and about 30% identify as females and continue as females all their life, like Caster Semenya. Next. So it turns out all of the action that is done in research to try to bin people is in the methodology employed by the researchers. So if you want to separate people out, be exclusive at the beginning, you get the pink and blue. Playing tricks on me, yeah. Now go back. If you want to be inclusive, if you want to say, hey, we're all people, we're just going to put everybody in the bin according to the sex you were assigned at birth and maintained all the way through, then you get those black lines with the dot. You can't use testosterone to bin people. Which one do you want? Well, it's not a scientific question anymore. It's entirely a question of what your values are and whether you want to see individuals like Caster Semenya in sport or out of sport. This is how we can use science to be discriminatory. All right, next. All right, so let's say you say, all right, all that science stuff, data stuff, that's nothing. I don't want these women in sport. Right? There are people who say that. The regulations violate widely held guidelines for medical and research ethics. Next. So the IAAF and IOC have both said that they adhere to something called the Helsinki Declaration on Medical and Research Ethics. This is produced by an organization called the World Medical Association. That's from the Olympic Code, that's from the IAAF rulebook. you can't see it, but the yellow is highlighting that they adhere to the Helsinki Declaration. Next slide. The WMA, which created the Helsinki Declaration, has asked physicians not to implement the regulations because they violate medical ethics. The short story is they take perfectly healthy people and turn them into patients. And doctors aren't supposed to do that. There's no reason in the world for these women to undergo medical treatment for health. It is simply for the cosmetics of sport. Next. So IAAF has said, well, if you can't find a doctor, we'll find one who will violate medical ethics. Here's what Dr. Berman says from IAAF. I hate to be disappointing, but for me the approach is quite simple. You want to compete in the protected feminine category? Then you must not oppose a treatment that affirms your feminine gender and lowers your T level to female norms. And all the more if you shout from the rooftops that you are a woman. But in the end, maybe you don't want to do it because you won't have the money and the glory. Next slide. All right, so you're going to hear more from Andy shortly, but medical ethics and scientific integrity continue to present significant challenges for IAAF. One of the recommended medical treatments involves surgery for women. This is what Berman says about this surgery. This treatment has been demonized by bioethics brokers who cogitate in their beautiful Stanford offices. If you follow this issue, you'll know who he's talking about. But who have never brought their US-centric vision to bear on the very real situations of these African DSD athletes that I have encountered over the past 12 years. Next. So one of the athletes that allegedly Dr. Berman encountered, Annette Nagisa, I think we'll hear more from about Andy, but this issue is continuing. Apparently, the French government is investigating the IAAF over allegations that they performed surgeries without consent on 4 athletes earlier this decade. Also, we heard, if you're paying attention in the last session, David Howman said that the Athletics Integrity Unit of IAAF is actively investigating the same issue. Caster Semenya's case is now before the Swiss Federal Tribunal, which can only review procedural elements. There's other avenues. Who knows if she or her lawyers, I don't have any inside information, but who knows if they're going to continue this fight. But it's clear that there's a fight still to occur based only on the misuse of science, the violation of ethics. Next slide. So that's the 4 fatal flaws. One more. There you go. So you can find me. I'm here this week. I'm on Twitter at Roger Puckett. If you have questions, I'm going to post up the slide. We'll talk with my paper with Madeline, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger. Our next speaker is Andy Brown. Andy's the editor of the Sports Integrity Initiative in the UK, an internet site that deals with issues that affect broad-ranging integrity challenges in sport. Andy's been a journalist for over 15 years and has followed the Caster Semenya case from the very beginning several years ago. Prior to working at the Sports Integrity Initiative, he was the editor of World Sports Law Report for about 8 years, and he's also worked for the Press Association and has written for numerous trade magazines. So please welcome Andy Brown.
Yeah, hello, and a bit of a disclaimer from me as well. Steve was very kind to describe the panel as experts. I'm not an expert, I should say. Neither am I an expert witness at the CAS or anything like that. At the moment, I just feel a bit like a jet-lagged journalist from the UK. But I'm going to do my best to sort of take you through sort of what I've learned from this case, because I've been following it now for about 10 years. And I would say for about the last 10 years, although it would deny it, the IAAF has been calling Caster Semenya a man. Next slide. The latest sort of incarnation of this is that Semenya and all DSD athletes are biological males, to use the quote marks again. I'm not saying they're biological males, that's the IAAF saying that they And as Roger pointed out as well, Caster Semenya was born and raised as a woman. She identifies as a woman, and the IAAF's persecution of her as a live case that it's been unable to solve is likely to have had an impact on her psychologically and mentally, including how she views her own gender. And at the start of this month, this is what she wrote in the Players' Tribune. When I was older, in 2009, I got an opportunity to represent my country. I was 18 and it was my first professional race, the 800 metres in Berlin. It was the IAAF World Championships. I won the gold, my first professional race, and I won gold. I was the best in the world. But people didn't celebrate that. That's not what they said about me. They said that I was a man, that I had an advantage, that my testosterone was too high. They didn't say I was the first black South African woman to win gold at the World Championships. They didn't say that I was the best. They didn't see me as an 18-year-old woman. They didn't see me as a young girl from the bush who was the best in the world. They didn't see me as human at all. They saw me as science, and they wanted to test my body. And she said, but do you know what I do? I ignore all of them. I don't read such things. I don't hear them. So I would say that Caster Semenya is actually a very strong, incredibly strong woman. Next slide. And as Roger pointed out, at the CAS, the IAAF played what I call its kind of trump card. Firstly, it sort of changed the DSD regulations so that they only apply to the 46XY karyotype, to use the term. This allowed it to claim that they only apply to, here's the quote marks again, biologically male athletes who want to seek to compete in the female category. And secondly, it clarified that the DSD regulations aren't about elevated testosterone providing an on-field advantage at all, as Roger pointed out as well. They're basically about what elevated testosterone has already done to the body from puberty onwards. So I've called this a kind of legacy advantage that the IAAF's created for itself, that it argues. And it argues that the DSD athletes have garnered this advantage from physiological changes due to having undergone male puberty. Okay? But, very conveniently, this advantage, measuring it, is pretty much impossible, because how would you measure the changes that have gone on your body from puberty onwards? It's an impossible measurement to make. So, therefore, all it had to do to prove its case at the Court of Arbitration for Sport was to show that 46XY athletes, to use its term biologically male athletes, run faster than 46XX athletes, and also that its methods of slowing them down were proportionate. So as such, as Roger pointed out as well, the whole sort of performance advantage thing is something of a misnomer. It doesn't really matter to the IAAF's changed case anymore. So this amendment allowed the CAS to rule that although the DSD regulations are discriminatory, they pursued a sort of legitimate objective of fair competition in female sports by seeking to exclude the unfair performance advantage that the IAAF asserted that biologically male athletes hold. And it found that the IAAF had proved that 46XY athletes run faster than 46XX athletes, and despite the side effects, its methods of slowing them down in medicating them were both proportionate and effective. So next slide, please. And of course, take a minute to look at this slide, actually. Of course, we can't have athletes with an unfair advantage by virtue of their different biological sex competing against other athletes, can we? It's kind of that. Next slide. The first disconnect in the whole argument. The IAAF's arguing, basically, that 46XY DSD athletes already hold an advantage from the action elevated testosterone is performed on them from puberty onwards, okay? And to compensate for that advantage, it's medicating their natural hormonal balance by requiring them to reduce their testosterone levels to below 5 nanomoles per litre. So basically, it's not regulating the advantage which it asserts that the athletes hold anyway. It's saying that they hold an advantage from the action from puberty onwards, but it's medicating them to compensate for that advantage. That brings us on to the second disconnect. As Roger's pointed out as well, as it did when promulgating or coming up with the original DSD regulations, the IAAF relied on unpublished evidence. The study it used was unpublished at the time, so conveniently nobody could look at it to see if it actually held weight. And it used evidence from the field to illustrate that 46XY DSD athletes run faster. Jonathan Taylor described these results as incredible and Dorian Coleman as devastating. This evidence was only seen by those at the hearing, who had to sign a confidentiality agreement stating they wouldn't disclose it. The evidence was redacted in the CAS judgment, so you couldn't see it in the judgment either. Okay? It was supposedly to protect the athlete's privacy, which is a legitimate reason. A similar approach, as Roger pointed out, was adopted when they were coming up with the DSD regulations in the first place. The study they used, which Roger and Madeline have consistently pointed out is completely inaccurate, wasn't published. Nobody could see it, yet they promulgated the regulations anyway, without having the study there. You know, it hadn't been published, and it's since been amended, it's been flawed. We are where we are. But the same appears to hold true for the IAAF's famous redacted evidence from the field. Next slide, please. Oh, we're in the right place. Yeah, however, in this situation, what the IAAF has done in this situation is far, far worse. Basically, the IAAF used medically damaged athletes to prop up the DSD regulations. And this is where it gets quite nasty. Ahead of the London 2012 Olympics, 4 young athletes who were 18, 20, 20 and 21 were told they needed to lower their testosterone in order to continue competing. And a gonadectomy would help them do that. Right? The surgery was carried out under the hyperandrogenism regulations. I hate saying that word because it's really difficult to say hyperandrogenism regulations. And that was the forerunner to the DSD regulations. However, all 4 of these athletes underwent feminising procedures that were nothing to do with lowering their testosterone. A 2013 study detailed the procedures, and a 2014 comment from medical experts warned that what the IAAF was doing was unethical and potentially medically harmful. Yet that seems to have been ignored completely. The procedures detailed in the slide are a nice way of saying that all 4 women underwent partial clitoral amputation and surgical widening of the vagina. Nice. The study reveals that the surgery was proposed to the athletes, and one of the doctors involved is Dr. Stéphane Beaumont, director of the IAAF Health and Science Department. And given that the surgery was suggested to the young athletes in a context where sport was outlining they wouldn't be eligible to compete as a woman, there are serious questions about whether the athletes consented to the surgery anyway. Next slide, please. This is footage here from a recent excellent documentary that I urge anyone who's interested in this area to watch. It revealed that at least 2 of the 4 women didn't understand what was happening to them, and they'd been medically handicapped by the surgery. None were given follow-up treatment. 1 athlete nearly died, and another wished she'd died on the operating table in order that the people that had done this to her be held responsible for what happened to her. And of course, sport became impossible for them. Next slide, please. Data from 3 of these 4 athletes was actually used by the IAAF to show that lowering testosterone levels of 46XY DSD athletes slows them down. Well, of course it does. Their primary means of producing hormones, their internal testicles have been removed, and they've also undergone a horribly traumatic procedure. They're not getting the hormones their body needs. The documentary showed the health problems these athletes have suffered. One has difficulty standing even these days. There are other athletes who we could point to who've had similar problems from similar surgery. Yet even more remarkably, I understand the reason that only 3 of the 4 athletes were used is because 1 actually showed a performance increase post-surgery. So not only have the athletes been medically harmed in the name of the IAAF's DSD regulations, but they might not even be effective in what they're trying to do, which is slow the athletes down. In other words, they may well have been unnecessary surgery. It was unnecessary anyway, but it might have been unnecessary in the IAAF's aims of performing the surgery. Next slide. So it would appear that CAS allowed the IAAF to manipulate what Caster Semenya was appealing, and what it argued it was regulating in order to win its case at the Court of Arbitration of Sport. It allowed the IAAF to change both the DSD regulations and its arguments, even post-hearing. Roger pointed out pre-hearing. but even post-hearing they changed what they were arguing. This shows why athletes who face complex issues, such as this one, shouldn't bring their cases before the Court of Arbitration for Sport. They just shouldn't go there. If I can discover that the IAAF based part of its evidence on medical harm performed on athletes, then so should CAS arbitrators, really. Either they don't want to know, or they just don't care. Christine Morley, who's pictured there, was successful in her case before the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. This is a human rights issue we're talking about today, and it isn't going away anytime soon. Last slide, please. And I'd say thanks very much. There's the references, but I'll put my slides up afterwards so you can pick those up. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. And our last speaker tonight is Madeline Pegg. Maddie is an Olympian and a former 800-meter runner who competed for Australia at the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing and at the 2019 World Championships in
2009,
Berlin.
sorry. Last week.
She also competed in the 4x400 relay in Berlin. She won the women's 800 meter at the 2009 World University Games and is ranked 5th all-time in Australia with a personal best of 1:59.92. In 2019, she completed her PhD in sociology at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and she's currently a postdoctoral fellow in the Department of Sociology and Science and Human Culture program at Northwestern University. Her research examines the knowledge politics surrounding scientific claims about biological sex, with a particular focus on eligibility policies in international sport and inclusion policies for the study of sex and gender in biomedicine. Please welcome Maddie Pegg.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Steve, and thanks also to the Play the Game organisers for providing me with this very timely opportunity to share my perspective on this topic. It's a very polarising and divisive issue and is very upsetting for people, and a lot of people have very strong views on this topic, and rightfully so. But I'm going to try to take a more nuanced and less combative approach in this presentation to what I've done in the past, so see how that goes. Thanks. I come to this area of regulation as a former 800-metre runner, and I competed for Australia in the 800 metres at the 2008 Olympic Games, and then also, and importantly for this story, the following year at the World Championships in Berlin, where although I did not progress past the heats of that event, I did in fact draw the same heat as Caster Semenya, the young up-and-coming South African star at those championships. So I had the experience of competing against her at the championships, where she of course not only progressed to the semis but to the final and came away victorious as the newly crowned world champion in the women's 800 metres. The 10-year controversy surrounding her right to compete as a female athlete originated at those championships, so I had the opportunity to be there to see it unfolding on the ground. From that point of view, this is my view from the track. At the time, I was quick to conclude that, sure, maybe I didn't want Semenya competing in my event, but I knew nothing about the history of sex testing practices in sport. I knew nothing really even about variation in human sex development. I was encountering these ideas for the first time. And I was immersed in a sporting culture in which there was no critical reflection on whether this was how we should be treating our new world champion, as well as other women alleged to have variations in their sex development. Because my running career ended abruptly in 2010 with an injury, I turned to academia as my plan B, and I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to do my graduate studies. It was really only there that I encountered challenges to my perspective at the time in 2009. And as part of that journey, I ended up testifying in 2015 in support of Judy Chand when she took her appeal to the Court of Arbitration for Sport. So just briefly, today I'm going to share some insights from my own experience since Berlin. I'll share some insights from my research, which is my view from the field, if you like. I'm going to offer a framework, sort of test a framework for making sense of how how or why this issue is being so divisive in the sport of track and field, and particularly amongst advocates of women's sport. And I'm going to offer some questions for us to reflect on going forward. Just a quick note to clarify some terminology. I understand gender and sex as entangled rather than distinct from one another. They're entangled in our language, they're entangled in our lives as well. So even though I may sometimes use the term sex during this presentation, it's with the understanding that it's a complicated concept and it's never purely biological. Second, I'm going to use the terms female and male because these are the terms that we use to describe competition categories in track and field. But again, I'm not implying that these are purely biological categories. And then also not internally coherent, and they do oversimplify how gender and sex actually occurs in our bodies and in our lives. Third, I prefer to refer to female athletes, the female athletes who are subject to these regulations, as women with higher testosterone, just so that I can avoid using terminology that some people find stigmatising. But I do recognise that it's not the most accurate term I could be using in relation to this issue. And then fourth, I don't use the term intersex unless someone has claimed that as their identity. So many elite female athletes with high testosterone don't identify as intersex. They identify as female and as women. So it would be incorrect and inappropriate to impose the term intersex onto them. So it's now 10 years since the World Championships in Berlin, and over that time my position on this issue has changed. It certainly didn't happen overnight, and it was a journey during which I often felt very confronted and also conflicted. But this came about because I had a change in career. Injury led me to grad school. There was a change in my understanding of the biology or the science surrounding what sex is, how it occurs in our bodies, how it relates to athletic performance. Thank you, Anne Foster-Sterling in particular, for leading me in that direction. I moved into a different cultural or ideological environment in which I was exposed to alternative points of view. And while I initially struggled with that and found it very confronting, over time I was able to hear out and begin to consider the legitimacy of alternative points of view. And then I think perhaps most critically, there was a change in my understanding of the stakes of regulating inclusion in women's sport. And that happened by becoming friends with women with high testosterone, women who identify as intersex, and trans women. And realising that A, what we do in sport does have broader implications for the ability of such women to live livable lives. And B, I wasn't prepared to tell my friends that sure, I recognised them as women outside of the track, but I wouldn't welcome them alongside me on the track. So I began to ask, why was I so uncritical as an athlete in Berlin in 2009? And then watching what unfolded in the lead up to the 2016 Olympic Games, where Semenya and two other women of colour from global South nations were subjected to intense scrutiny about their right to compete. I wanted to start to investigate the culture of track and field and consider what had changed and how we could make sense of this ongoing controversy. So part of my dissertation research involved conducting interviews with elite stakeholders in track and field, so athletes, coaches, team officials, media commentators, journalists, and so on. I'm just going to describe some of the themes that came out of these interviews, and I'm really just going to be going in broad strokes here, and I'd be very happy to share some papers that I've written if you are interested in reading further. So just four overarching themes that I'll highlight today. First, widespread misunderstanding and misinformation. Second, stakeholder opinions on the legitimacy of regulating women with high testosterone were not driven by science, even though this issue is often framed as a scientific matter. Third, there is evidence of institutional racism. And fourth, there is a very deep-seated fear of change and the unknown, not only in relation to redefining women's sport as inclusive of women with high testosterone, but also in relation to trans women. Okay, so in slightly more detail, athletes and coaches often have limited understanding of the complex scientific debates around testosterone and its relationship to sex differences in performance, even though they like to privilege science as the rationale for forming their stance on this topic. Stakeholders form their opinions in spite of or without, rather than because of or with scientific evidence. So in other words, it's a case of policy first, scientific justification second, rather than allowing policy and opinion to be informed by or guided by scientific evidence. And again, this is even though they believe that these rules should be science-driven. Governing bodies and team management do little to educate athletes and coaches, and they also promote only their version of the story. Relatedly, much information exchange about this topic is going on informally, such as via social media. Women of colour from global South nations are believed to be the appropriate focus of scrutiny and regulatory interventions. This is believed to be a justified focus on women from global South nations. And the disproportionate impact of these rules on such women, the harm that these women who are impacted experience under the regulations, is not considered to be a reason to question or even think more carefully about the legitimacy of these regulations. And then there's extensive underlying fear of change in the unknown, and it is in fact related primarily to the increased participation of trans women, even though trans women are subject to an entirely separate set of regulations. Okay, so there was a spectrum of opinion amongst those that I interviewed, but there was also pronounced polarisation, which I think we also see in the media, especially social media. In the recent aftermath of the Semenya appeal. So, one way to think of this is it's a case of one side being right and one side being wrong, but I think we can also add a bit of nuance to this divide that we're seeing. To begin with, track and field is definitely a gender-divided sport in the sense that we have separate male and female categories, but it's also the case that it's an unequal sport for women. If we take a look at the progression of women's events that have been added to the Olympic program and how it compares to men, we've got 1960 for the 800 metres, which was when it was reintroduced, having been pulled from the program in 1928, compared to 1896 for men. The marathon is another classic example, 1984 for women versus 1896 for men. 2008, when I competed at the Olympic Games, I think actually the significance was really lost on me at the time as an athlete, that was actually the first time that my teammates were having the opportunity to strive for and compete in a 3K steeple at the Olympic level, even though it had been an event for men since 1920. Not to mention, of course, the marked underrepresentation of women in leadership, coaching, other decision-making positions. So, is this sense that women's sport is precarious